So here we're going to continue with post-midterm material, turning from looking at the media and the public to ways in which politicians engage in the politics part of things, right? So instead of how they engage with institutions, how they engage in politics. So first we're going to look at parties, right? We started talking about parties when we talked about Congress and how parties can facilitate collective action in Congress. This is actually why we have parties in Congress in the first place. In the early Congresses, it was fine, right? Everyone in the first Congress knew everyone else, knew how they were going to vote, knew what was going to happen. But in the second Congress, some people had left and some new people had come in. And now we don't always know how everyone is going to behave. So to allow for stable, durable alliances that last more than just the term of one Congress member, we need to create some sort of system, basically a shorthand of saying what we stand for. Parties are a great way to do that, right? So parties allowed for organization and long-term durable coalitions in Congress. It allowed people to identify who was going to vote with them on a certain thing, who they might be able to go to get a vote, right? Who they would be more likely to be able to rely on in log rolling agreements. And of course, then who they should listen to when determining how to vote on something. So parties in Congress evolved basically to facilitate collective action in Congress. But they quickly evolved past just being coalitions of like-minded members in Congress, right? That is still one aspect of parties, that is the party in the government. But we also know that parties do a lot more, right? The party also is in the electorate. Why do we have parties in the electorate? Well, really to link the electorate, us, voters, with the parties in Congress. It makes it much easier for us to hold these durable coalitions accountable if we too are divided up into these different parties. If we too understand and identify with the ideology and positions of certain parties, right? It also can help us when we vote, hold parties accountable. We know what party is in Congress. We know if we're happy with Congress or not. So we know who to vote for, right? If we have these parties in the electorate, it's easier for us to do that. It also helps facilitate elections, right? This is why politicians join parties. It's much easier to run with a party than without one, partially because parties as organizations, right? That's the third role of the party. Parties in government, parties in the electorate, and parties as organizations. They join them because there's this organization that can help them campaign, that can help them raise money, say get donor lists, or also just lists of people who will put up yard signs or respond to emails, come to fundraisers or rallies where you just want, sort of people in the crowd, right? So there's an organization that helps politicians run for office. And they need this, but they also need that link with the party and the electorate, right? If I identify as a Republican or as a Democrat and someone's running with absolutely no party, how do I know what they stand for? Well, I'm going to have to listen to them and listen to all their points and maybe read their campaign website or a mailer or something. I don't necessarily have time for that, right? And as we all know, people are cognitive misers. So why waste your time doing that? Why have to put in the effort to learn about a candidate when you have two perfectly good main party candidates right there whose positions you know, right? So politicians join parties because they know they can't run without the party label, both because people in general are much more likely to vote with their party label than with anything else, and because the party has an organization behind them. So politicians join parties for those reasons. They gain a lot, right? They gain voters, they gain support, both in terms of public support and in terms of actual logistical support, right? But they lose something critical. There is a conformity cost to joining a party, right? They lose some independence. they now have to conform to party positions. How many pro-life Democrats are there? How many pro-choice Republicans? Right? It's very rare for politicians to deviate too far from major tenets of the party platform. Now, there are issues that are not clearly aligned with party, right? Things like free trade, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, which Obama championed. Obviously, he was a Democrat, but there were quite a few Democrats who were very much against the TPP, and there were some Republicans who were for it, right? So there are some issues that do not break down on party lines, and that's when parties aren't great at informing us as voters what a politician's position is. But for a lot of the really big issues that the average person in the public is going to care about, things like abortion, gun control, certain issues of civil rights or civil liberties, right? Marriage equality, gender issues, things like that, likely it's very clear which party goes with which. It's also very clear which party goes with which position on things like tax policy and corporate policy, right? So you're not going to see a lot of Democrats who, if any, who say, let's cut Social Security funds so then we don't have to raise taxes. It's just not going to happen because you have to conform to certain aspects of the party in order to be a member of that party, right? And that's what you lose. You lose your sort of autonomy, your ability to have other positions on certain issues. But you still gain a lot more, right? You still gain a ton. And it more than makes up for this conformity cost for most politicians. Some don't think so, and this is why they may switch parties. This is why, obviously, Bernie Sanders, when he's running for Senate, doesn't run with one of the main parties, right? He runs as an independent. So actually, he doesn't run with a party at all. Now, he did have to run with a party for president, right? He ran in the Democratic primary. He didn't just try to run for president as a third party, right? As someone who wasn't one of the two main parties. Because it just wasn't going to happen. He was never going to win. So he doesn't want to pay the conformity costs when he's in the Senate because he can win without a party. But to run for president, he was willing to pay the conformity costs. Speaking of presidential elections, right? We talked specifically, we had 2 days on elections, looking at presidential elections and then congressional elections. Now, obviously, we know presidential election years have the highest turnout. And in presidential election years, Congress members of the president's party are likely to do better. Right? This is sometimes called the coattails theory. Right? Congress members ride to victory on the president's coattails. This is the surge part of surge and decline. Right? Congress has a surge of the president's party members during presidential years. But then during non-presidential years, when we don't have the president's coattails, we see a decline. Now, why is there a decline? Is it just because there's no coattails effect anymore? Maybe, but also probably because the midterm elections can be seen as a referendum on the president. This was especially true in 2010 as a referendum on Obama, and now 2018 as a referendum on Trump, right? If people don't think the president is doing well, it's only 2 years into his term, they can't get rid of him yet. They can't vote him out. He's not up for re-election. But they can do the next best thing. They can hold his party accountable, right? So again, how parties help the public. We can hold the president accountable even in years when he's not up for re-election by punishing his party. So that is another reason why we have the decline. So the surge we tend to see because of the coattails effect, and the decline we tend to see both because of withdrawal of the coattails effect and because it's a referendum on the president. Now, the decline doesn't always mean that the president's party is going to lose control of Congress, right? If they have control, they may not lose it in the decline, but they may weaken their control. They may also, in fact, lose it. Likewise, the surge doesn't necessarily mean they gain control of Congress, though typically it does. They may already have had control of Congress. But we do see the president's party gains seats during presidential election years and loses seats during midterm election years. Since the modern presidency, so since the end of World War II, there have only been 2 exceptions to this rule. So it's a lot of elections, right? Every 2 years since 1945. Well, 1946 would have been the next election year. Federal election year, I should say. So there have been a lot of elections since then, right? Only 2 exceptions. And those exceptions are George Bush's first midterms. That was 2002, right? His party, the Republicans, won seats. That's likely a sort of effect of the aftermath of 9/11. People thought he did a pretty good job handling it. People thought the Republicans in Congress had done a pretty good job handling it. And no one really wants to sort of change who they're backing at times of crisis. Now, the other exception is sort of even more exceptional. It's the midterm election immediately before that. So President Bill Clinton's second midterm election, that's 1998. He actually won seats, and for a second midterm election, that is huge. This was most likely because people were really fed up with the Republicans in Congress. At that point, the Republicans had been spending so much time going after Clinton on impeachment charges that the public just felt like the charges, even if they didn't like what Clinton had done, most people thought the charges were a little bit overblown. And more than that, it had been so long at this point that everyone just wanted the government to get back to governing. So they were really unhappy with the Republicans doing this and distracting everyone from governing. So they ended up voting more Democrats in, right? Because Bill Clinton was a Democrat. So there were those 2 exceptions, and they were consecutive midterm elections, right? So it seemed like maybe the theory was in trouble. But since 2002, it is held. Every presidential election year, we see a surge. Every midterm year, we see a decline. Right? Again, surge and decline in the in the number of the president's partisans in Congress. So we kind of just talked about the role of parties in campaigning and in the electorate, right? They provide a shorthand cue for voters. They help candidates organize their elections. The nomination process, though, for president has a lot to do with parties, right? We see these big party primary elections for the president. And even though there are primary elections for other office, we don't tend to pay that much attention to them unless there's something really interesting going on in the party primary, right? The last gubernatorial election, for example, when Cynthia Nixon was running to challenge Governor Cuomo, that was kind of interesting, right? A TV star. She was making a lot of noise in her campaign, bringing in a lot of big donations. So people started paying a little attention. But for the most part, the main party primaries that we pay attention to are the presidential primaries, because they're so long and they're so important. They choose who will run for office in November in the general election. So parties in the past had a lot more control over the nomination process. The nomination wasn't done through any sort of public vote. It was done entirely by party officials, right? This might be elected members of the party who were elected to office, or just members of the party organization who were not in office. And that role has declined dramatically since the progressive reforms, right? And by now we really see that for the most part, the party does not play a massive role in the nomination process. Though they may play some role before the nominations. This is the theory put forth in the book The Party Decides, which we didn't really talk about. So don't worry too much about that. Other than still the parties may have some sort of say, right? This was certainly Bernie Sanders' argument in 2008 when Clinton beat him in the not 2008, 2016, my mistake, when Clinton beat him in the primaries, right? He said, well, the party coalesced around her because she was the party favorite and he was an outsider. And certainly that did to some extent play out again this time, though there were a lot more outsiders this time who got in, and had it made it to the conventions, the superdelegates, those who are party officials who get to decide who they want to vote for rather than the pledged delegates who are chosen by the voters, they wouldn't have been able to play a role in the first round of voting. So the party did arguably play less of a role this time, even though it worked out that it was the party's favored candidate. Now, for the Republican nomination in 2016, it wasn't the party's favored candidate, right? The Republican establishment didn't really want Trump, but they weren't entirely sure who they wanted. There were just so many people in the race, and that became the issue because they didn't know who to pick. The public ended up picking for them. So we see that parties still have some control over the nomination process, but not nearly as much. And they certainly help in campaigns and help in the electorate by organizing things, by providing resources to candidates, by running ads for candidates, right? We know that they're not the same kind of ads that candidates run, right? They're soft money ads, so they can't include certain magic words, as the court called them. But they can still run sort of party-building ads. They can do all sorts of party-building efforts, like get out the vote drives. So they are very useful to candidates. And we know, obviously, they're useful to candidates in the sense that they provide party cues for the electorate when we all go out and vote. Now, I do want to take 1 second to talk a bit more about advertising, right? A lot of people really complain about negative advertising. You often see media coverage during elections sort of lamenting the tone of the campaign. Oh, it's so negative. Look at all these negative advertisements. Look how much the candidates are attacking each other. But candidates still use them. Why? Well, it turns out that negative advertisements probably work. They increase voter knowledge. They can increase name recognition, right? If you don't know a candidate very well, and they keep running a whole bunch of attack ads on their opponent, you're also going to learn their name. And they don't seem to suppress voter turnout. A lot of concern that people would be so upset with the negative tone of the race they'd just tune out altogether and stop voting, but we don't see that being the case. In fact, they may increase your free media coverage. Right? That Willie Horton ad I gave you in the advertising playlist, that one ran only once late at night in a very small media market. It cost them virtually no money to run, and as you can see from the production values, very little money to make. And yet, it got replayed constantly because it was so controversial on all the nightly news programs. So suddenly, it was being played in prime time when people are actually watching television, and it was being discussed. And that message got out. The person it was attacking, right, Dukakis, did end up losing. Now, possibly the claim that the Willie Horton ad was sort of the end of Dukakis's campaign is very overblown. Likely there were a lot of other factors that played a role, and he was already starting to slip in approval polling before the Willie Horton ad came out. But still, we see that it certainly didn't hurt H.W. Bush's campaign, right? H.W. Bush was the sponsor of the ad. And it may have helped him, and it certainly helped get the message out there by getting all these free replays. Now, they don't work perfectly. We don't see them change voters' minds very often. Most voters don't see a negative advertisement and go, oh, well, now I realize I don't want to vote for that candidate. For example, that Daisy ad that I put on the thing, the attack ad that was run by Johnson's campaign, most likely people who are already not going to vote for Johnson didn't see that ad and go, oh, well, now I realize he cares about our children not being blown up by nuclear weapons. Okay, I'll vote for him, right? They don't tend to really persuade voters who already know who they're going to vote for they may help persuade those marginal voters, those few voters who don't know who they're going to vote for. They may help there. And in any case, they don't hurt. So why not try them, right? If you have the money and there's really seemingly no downside to doing it, and there may be an upside, why not go for it? Now, speaking of money in campaigns, money plays a huge role in government, obviously, right? Money often comes from interest groups. Now, we know that interest groups probably don't buy candidates in the traditional sense. Even if they put money into elections, likely they are doing that because the candidate they're funding already supports their position. For example, the NRA isn't going to put a whole bunch of money behind an anti-gun Democrat in the hopes of buying that Democrat's pro-gun vote, right? They're not going to support an anti-gun candidate just to try to swing that candidate to be pro-gun. It's a waste of money. So when we see candidates who have a lot of NRA funding voting pro-gun, they're probably not voting pro-gun because the NRA funded them. They're probably funded by the NRA because they were always going to vote pro-gun. So it's the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? After it, therefore because of it. A candidate who is not currently in office, just a candidate, can't vote pro-gun until they're in office. So if they are helped in their campaign by the NRA, an interest group, and then in office they vote pro-gun, the vote happens after the campaign donation. But just because it happened after didn't mean it caused it, right? Likely both the donation and the vote were caused by that particular candidate's own ideology. Now, interest group money may sort of activate bias, right? It may sort of make a candidate who was always going to be pro-gun be more actively pro-gun. So it might sort of emphasize positions, but it certainly doesn't buy a position. Also, interest groups, there's interest groups on all sides of things, right? So if you're pro-gun, you'll get your money from the NRA. But if you're anti-gun, it's not like you have no sources of money, right? There's all sorts of anti-gun lobbies. For example, the Brady campaign, right? They do a lot of funding for candidates, right? So there's money on both sides. You don't need to change your position to get the money. There will be money somewhere. So because of all these different interest groups, it's very unlikely that any interest group can really buy up candidates. Also, and we saw this in our class discussion online, right? Some interest groups will actually spend money on all candidates just to sort of show that they're involved, right? Just to remind candidates, hey, I'm here, and maybe it buys a little bit of face time with the candidate, right? They get into office, and, you know, some corporation who's donated to both campaigns calls up and says, hey, you know, I'd like to talk to you about this bill that's being proposed. And the congressmember or senator might say, well, you did donate a lot of money. Okay, I can give you 5 minutes. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're buying a vote, but they might be buying sort of time or interest in a way. And so certainly we can see how interest groups do have some potential through the elections to affect governance. But that has a huge caveat in that if a Congress member can sort of accurately gauge constituent sentiment, for example, if there happens to be something that there's been a poll done on, or they have enough money in a campaign to run a poll, or they get a lot of constituent calls about something, if they can figure out reliably what constituents think, and the constituents think something different than the interest groups who've been giving them money, they will still go with the constituents, because all the money in the world doesn't buy you an election if your constituents hate you, right? So certainly, if you know what your constituents want, you're going to go with what they want over with what a special interest wants. Now, interest groups can certainly help out because there's so many of them on all sides. They sometimes have enough money and enough ability to find out the interest of a politician's constituents, to find out how the constituents would want the Congress member or senator to vote. They can organize letter writing or phone calling campaigns. So interest groups can sometimes help get the information about constituent interest to the politician, right? But again, they're not creating that interest, right? They're just helping to mobilize it and to inform the Congress members. Now, this is hard for interest groups, right? There's a lot of collective action barriers in organizing. And I talked about these a lot on the slides for the day on interest groups and campaign finance. So I encourage you to look there if you don't understand what I'm saying when I talk about collective action barriers and interest groups. Now, interest groups obviously do go hand in hand with campaign spending and regulation, right? Who can spend money in a campaign and who can donate money in a campaign. And we had two big cases that are involved, Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United. And I do encourage you to go back to the slides on campaign finance and look at those two decisions. For the most part, the big key takeaways from both is that money does equal speech. And in Buckley versus Vallejo, the court was willing to cap donations to sort of level the playing field and to get rid of even the appearance of impropriety, even the appearance that people could buy an election. But they refused to limit how much campaigns could spend in an election, right? So they can spend as much as they raise, but they can only raise a certain amount from each individual. Again, the idea is sort of being to level the playing field because democracy is meant to be one person, one vote. All voices count equal, but money is not distributed equally. By limiting how much any person can donate to a campaign, we sort of level the playing field for the public and for their voice in contributing to a campaign. Now, Buckley versus Vallejo also set up that distinction between soft money and hard money that I briefly mentioned when I was just talking about advertisements, right? Hard money is money donated directly to the campaign. And that money is highly regulated. Campaigns have to keep very careful track of where the money came from and where the money is going. And things like campaign advertisements bought with hard money now have the candidate at the end saying, I'm so-and-so and I approve this message, right? That's hard money that's being spent there. Soft money is spent by parties and also by major political action committees and interest groups that have their own PACs. So the NRA has a specific PAC that participates in electoral work, like running ads. We see something like Planned Parenthood, right? Planned Parenthood is an organization that is nonpartisan and provides health care for individuals, but they also have a PAC that is completely separate. If you donate to Planned Parenthood, you are not donating to their PAC. If you donate to their PAC, you are not donating to Planned Parenthood. It's a separate thing. And that PAC will run soft money ads sometimes. Now, soft money ads don't have the candidate in them, and they must avoid certain magic words, as the court said, right? Key phrases like vote for, vote against, support, defeat, right? Anything that sounds like you're advocating for or against a candidate must go away. But as we saw with those soft money ads I posted on the list, and in the campaign finance class, that NRA ad from the that I posted on the campaign finance slides, and that ad, that one was clearly against Clinton and for Trump, even though it never explicitly said vote against Clinton or vote for Trump. And then I also posted that Clinton ad on the YouTube playlist of campaign ads that looked an awful lot like her ad, but was in fact a PAC, right? So there are, again, key differences between the hard money ad and the soft money ad. Citizens United allowed corporations to get into the mix, also allowed unions and other big organizations of that nature to get in, allowed super PACs to really form and throw a lot of money into politics. So also sort of increased the role of dark money. Dark money is money spent by nonprofit organizations. It's a specific designation of nonprofit organization And they can, again, issue advocacy ads as long as they are not express advocacy ads. Now, the thing about nonprofits is, unlike soft money donated to PACs or hard money donated to campaigns, dark money donated to nonprofits can be anonymous, right? You can donate to a nonprofit and not reveal your name. So nonprofits may only be running ads funded by one or two very wealthy individuals, whereas even soft money ads can't really get away with that under the terms from Buckley versus Vallejo. And so we do see that Citizens United has increased the prevalence of dark money in campaigns. Again, dark money in contrast to soft money and hard money. Now, all this money is necessary. You cannot run a campaign without money, right? If I want to run for office tomorrow, I'm going to need to raise a lot of money to do it, right? Campaigns cost money. You might not have to pay volunteers, but you're going to have to pay some campaign staff, and you're probably going to want to provide pizza for the volunteers. You're going to end up having to print things, like even if you just have volunteers go house to house with a clipboard talking about your campaign, you're going to need to pay for those clipboards. You're going to need to pay for whatever materials those volunteers are giving to the people at their door, right? You're going to need to pay for advertisements, whether it's mail advertisements. We see that a lot still in, say, New York City council races, because the New York City media market is much bigger than New York City itself, and certainly a ton bigger than an individual council district. Most council candidates won't spend money on a campaign advertisement. They'll send out mailers instead, right? But they still need money to do that. Money is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. You can outspend your opponent and still lose, right? If you are unpopular, all the money in the world isn't going to buy you your election. Certainly saw this in Connecticut in 2010. Linda McMahon ran against an actually also unpopular Democrat, but she was wildly unpopular. She self-funded her campaign. She outspent him. I don't remember the ratio, but I think it was something like 3-1 she outspent him. I mean, many, many times what he spent. And she lost badly. She was just that unpopular, right? So money is necessary. You need it to run a campaign, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't mean you're going to win your campaign.